In this video we're looking at building techniques for the Newman Miniatures N-gauge model of the Stirling Single, one of the most famous and iconic locomotives of the Victorian period. This is a little different to some of the other models in the range, so we're going to be explaining the two main areas for construction. First off, if we concentrate on the tender, there are three different versions of tender to go with the Stirling Single. The first is this one. This is an unpowered Ivet tender, just as the locomotive originally had in commercial operation. It's very simple to create. All you need to do is just slot in wheels, add couplings and a couple of minor details, just like the others in the range. We similarly have a rendition of the Sturrock tender, a shorter tender, which the locomotive famously had in preservation. These, as said, are unpowered tenders with an unpowered locomotive and are intended for use with, for example, the motorised coach, which we provide as part of a string of coaches to go with this locomotive, enabling full operation. The third tender is another Ivet tender. However, this one has been slightly stretched and altered in dimension. So although it is not strictly accurate, it does, however, fit a commercial motorised chassis for those who want the engine itself to be powered. Now, if I just bring along one of those motorised chassis, it does require a little bit of modification, easier than it sounds. If you remove the couplings and cut the ends off level with the metal chassis block, the top can be temporarily unclipped if necessary, and you can cut off the various side details and sand down the axle boxes to make a flush section underneath the running board. This can then have attached to it, if necessary, little pieces of plasticard to give a clean side. Now the chassis itself, modified I should say, looks like so. And with these little pieces in place, the bottom part of the chassis simply needs to be glued in situ. As for the top, there is a small lip, which you might be able to see, running just here. If I move it a bit closer, just here and here. You can fill up to that lip with weight and it will still clear the chassis. And if you want any more weight, you can of course put some in the coal area. That then fits on the top like so, and any gaps in the running board can be filled out with little shims of plasticard, so creating a motorised tender. Turning to the locomotive, much of this is in essence similar to other models in the Newman miniature range, particularly the fitting of the rear wheel set and the front bogie. But there are three areas which need a little bit more detail. Firstly, weight. For this particular model, it is best to ensure that the majority of weight added is over the main driving axle and the rear axle to maintain the level running. So the addition of lead weight, as you can see here, mostly around the firebox region, is to be advised. Secondly, you'll notice that attached to this are distinct slide bars. This is reasonably easy to do, but needs caution. These are 0.5mm by 1mm nickel steel strips, 15mm in length. Now, I've deliberately fitted them prior to any painting or priming. The slots for them are ready formed. It is a tight fit. Rather than risk damaging the model, it is better to round off the ends prior to fitting them. Similarly, it is best to be gentle and, if anything, sand down the metal rather than risk cracking the plastic itself. However, they can be slid in, and as you see, for the most part, look after themselves. You can also, of course, use a little bit of glue if necessary. I would also direct you to a couple of very small little blocks on the running board, which not only act as a support for the upper rod, but they give an exact indication of how far the rod should be slid in to get them at the correct measurement. Lastly, of course, that turns us to the case of the main driving wheel. The driving wheels are, of course, a bit atypical for N-gauge, being some of the largest ever used on Britain's railways. The wheels used here are Allen Gibson P4 driving wheels. the fine scale equivalent of 00, which fortunately is pretty similar to the requirements for N gauge. Now you can always cut down the axle which they provide, however we also provide a 3D printed axle for ease. The wheels can also have additional spokes put in them to give that extra element of authenticity. As for the rods themselves, there are in essence three options. Firstly, we provide solid 3D printed rods. These can be used directly as they are. Secondly, they can be used as templates for cutting your own out of brass if preferred. Thirdly, we have the rods you can see here, which have a slight gap in the back of them, which you can slot in a little bit of 0.5mm wire just to give some additional strength. I would also note that you may see that the small end, the piston rod connection, is actually slightly off centre. This is deliberate to give just a little bit more clearance against the running board. The rods are therefore handed and need to be this way round, with the slightly raised portion uppermost. All that needs to be done to fit these is, much like the various other rods on items such as the Stephenson's rocket, is to add a pin in the end. This slides in the sliding bars, as I'll show in just a moment, and then they can be slotted straight onto, in this case, Allen Gibson crank pins, which ultimately are then glued in place. So if I turn this round and show you what I mean, so if I just slot in one there, two there, and in place. So if I just turn that, you will see quite an easy movement. And of course this is going to be a little bit wobbly because there are no additional wheels, but assembly is frankly as simple as that. As just a little more advice on fitting the connecting rods, the drill sizes for the big end is 1.6mm and for the little end is 0.7mm. That's what I've personally found works best. And similarly, do double check the thickness of the big end, the wheel end of the connecting rod, against the particular brush being used on the crank pin, just to make sure that it isn't too tight. You might need to very, very gently file the end of the connecting rod just to make sure that it doesn't bind once all painted and assembled. Returning to the sprue of parts, you'll notice there are a couple of other bits on it. We have two cylinder covers. We also have renditions of the framing between the two front wheels. Now, there are various ways which these can be fitted. You can always cut the back off and glue them straight onto the cylinder. The only limitation, of course, is that it could potentially reduce the clearance of the bogie wheels and how tight the curves are which it can go around, which is why they've been designed with a block on the back of them, and you can mount them onto the bogie itself, so giving that little extra element of flexibility. So there we have it, the iconic Stirling Single in N gauge. I hope that this has been useful and of interest, and thank you for watching.